Today is Saturday, May 28th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This past week, we saw one of the most disturbing events that I can remember in my life in the school shooting in Texas, where I think 19 elementary school children were killed along with one or two teachers. And the thought of this happening in a school, as a former classroom teacher myself, as a father with children of the ages of the children who were killed, it's just incomprehensible to try to imagine that experience for the children, the teachers, the parents. There's just no way. There's no way it can be imagined. And as soon as these events occur, and we have to remember that they're rare, even though we may hear of them in the news periodically, we have to remember that we live in a country with 330 million people, with schools in every town in the entire country, thousands and thousands of schools. And an event in one isolated location is immediately broadcast through the news media everywhere. And it feels like these events are close when they're not. The world feels small. Time feels short. And really it's not. We live in a country of 330 million people. And one person chose to murder 19 children. It's hard for us to keep these things in perspective because the instantaneous nature of our news media, which is great in its ability to keep us informed, creates a skewed idea of what's actually going on around us and can lead us to have unrealistic judgments about the safety of our lives, about the quality of life in America, about the relative goodness or evil of American people. And we have to be careful to guard our hearts and understand that the ubiquitous or ever-present nature of the modern news media causes things to seem, when they're bad, like they're much worse than they actually are. And as terrible as this event was, we have to realize just how rare it is. We can't live in fear as if every person around us is about to kill us. This kind of timidity is a vice. It's a characteristic of an unrighteous man. The Proverbs teach that the wicked people flee when no one pursues them. In other words, they're afraid of things that don't actually exist. They're influenced by what the philosophers called groundless fears. And that's not a virtue, that's a vice. That's a weakness, morally speaking. The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. When we see our neighbors, or we see ourselves beginning to become timid, that's a vice that we have to take care to resist and oppose by practicing the opposite virtue, which is to be courage, or to live with fortitude. And we have to, again, make sure we understand what true courage is, because recklessness, audacity, these are vices on the opposite extreme and are not true courage. So these issues are confusing, and what always happens is Americans of the two opposing political parties begin arguing as to what the solution is for these problems. The folks on one side will complain that we have to change the laws to make these tragedies impossible, and the folks on the opposite side of the political divide will argue that this is just a necessary consequence of liberty and freedom that's guaranteed to us by the Second Amendment. And the fight goes on between these two sides as to what should or should not be done about these recurring tragedies. And I engage in these discussions, and I find them very unproductive, because really I don't think that when we're engaged in political discussions, I don't think we're really sincere in what we argue. We really don't care. The person on one side, let's say the liberal, the democratic American, they just want democratic principles to be enforced. They want democratic politicians to win and govern. And on the opposite side, the same thing is true. The conservatives, the Republicans, they just want their candidates to be in power. They want their principles to be enforced and promoted and rewarded. And that's really what they're concerned about. Many people will even vote contrary to the details of their conscience, because they're just concerned with the overall political outcomes of the elections. You know, they're willing to vote for a man like Donald Trump, who is a real moral, what's the word? I should just say an immoral person. I grew up in New Jersey, which is sort of Trump territory, and Donald Trump was always seen as a real slime ball. But because he takes up the cause of this conservative Republican Party and has the ability to win an election, he becomes a hero for his political effectiveness. The same thing happens on the other side. You can have a Catholic who is concerned about social justice issues and is willing to vote for a candidate who is pro-choice, contrary to the teaching of the church, and justifies that by his or her political concerns about some matters of social justice. And so we see that in political disputes, the details of the arguments are usually not serious. They're not carefully thought through. They're not even the items that Americans consider when they vote. for a particular candidate. We think in terms of this two-party system, and we argue in terms of this two-party system, and we're really not concerned with whether or not we have every issue right. We simply want our side to win the election and gain control of American life. This is the modern democratic political spirit of modern America. And these discussions, when they're fueled by political animosity and opposition, they're rarely productive. I could say they're never productive, because the two sides really aren't interested in finding a solution. They're simply interested in putting down their opponent in this two-party system. The two parties represent diverse groups on each side of the political spectrum that disagree amongst themselves on many issues, but put those disagreements aside on election day to make sure that their side, the right or the left, the Democrats or the Republicans, win the election. And they're content with the problem so long as their side succeeds. And so these political discussions, like I said, they're not sincere, they're not careful, they're not really sincere, and consequently they're just contentious and unproductive. And this is what we see all over social media. Unproductive wrangling. Usually they're arrogant, reckless. People discussing issues aren't even concerned about actually finding a solution. They're just arguing with each other to try to impress their friends on social media who see their arguments and like their posts. It's not real deliberation. I'd like to go further than that and actually deliberate on this question, this particular question of gun violence in America. And I'd like to not consider it as a political issue. I'd like to consider it as a moral issue. I'd like to consider it as a Christian moral issue and not as an American political issue. I don't care what the Constitution says. I don't care what the Second Amendment says. I don't care what the Supreme Court says or has said. I don't care what the Congress or the president says. I'm not talking about the topic of gun violence from a political interest. I'm talking about it from a moral, a Christian perspective. I'm not asking which side, right or left, Republican or Democrat, is right. That's irrelevant to this discussion. And I ask you to think about the question with me beyond politics, beyond right and left, beyond Republican and Democrat, beyond the Constitution, as a matter of conscience, as a matter of Christian morals, and think about what the best answer might be. Now, one of the problems, like I said, with these discussions is that those engaged in the discussions, if their minds are dominated by political controversy, what they try to do when a topic is discussed is they try to figure out what side you're on. Are you righty or lefty? Are you a liberal or a conservative? Are you a Republican or a Democrat? They try to label you with one of the two sides. And this is ridiculous. As if these issues are really that cut and dry, that black and white. That's a false dilemma And again, it may make sense in contemporary American politics, where we have a two-party system that's going to determine the outcome of the elections for many different reasons. But as Christians, we have to answer these questions absolutely and not just politically. We have to answer them morally. Jesus told us, "Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." And we have to put off these political categories that we think in and talk in political discussions, and we have to put on a Christian mind and think with a Christian spirit as we ask what is not what is expedient in America right now, but as we ask what is perfect. What is the perfect answer according to the teachings of Jesus Christ, who is the Lord, whose dominion transcends the government of the United States of America or the 21st century, where the Constitution transcends all human legislation and political institutions and is absolute and eternal, to which we are all accountable, ultimately and absolutely. We have to answer the question as Christians first, and then pursue that course in our political actions as Americans. Not think that just participating in the American controversies is sufficient. Now, I personally believe, and I'm willing to go out on a ledge and state my personal opinion, and I'll clarify this opinion after I make it. I believe that civilians should not be allowed to purchase or own weapons. I believe that civilians should not be allowed to purchase or possess weapons. I don't believe that civilians should be allowed to carry guns in public. I don't believe that civilians should be allowed to purchase weapons, or at the very least, I would say, purchase certain weapons. I believe that there should be strict regulations on access to weapons that are considered lethal. And in this talk, I'd like to think through that. I'd like to explain why that's my opinion as a matter of what I consider to be Christian perfection. I'd like to also talk about some of the arguments that I hear from people on both sides and what I think is wrong about their opinions. But just to make it clear, to repeat my opinion, my thesis as it were, I believe that the government, federal government, local government, should strictly regulate civilian access to lethal weapons. I think that's how I'd like to articulate my opinion. I believe the government should strictly regulate civilian access to lethal weapons. Now, to qualify that, it's not some extreme pacifist fantasy opinion. I have 3 adult children. All 3 of them are members of the U.S. military. I have children who are trained to kill as soldiers. I have children who own firearms. I myself do not own any weapons. We barely have sharp knives in our kitchen. I simply feel no need to think about or invest in or concern myself with any weapons of any kind. And I know some may criticize that, but I really don't care. I don't live with the fears that I see other men living with. I don't have those fears. I don't believe that I'm a step away from being attacked by someone. Life is more complicated than that. Where we live, how we live, and many other factors determine the degree of danger we live in. I've lived in places where there were present dangers. I've lived in places where we needed to make sure that everything was locked before we left the house or went to bed, and if it wasn't, it would be stolen when we got back. I've lived in places where there's no need to even lock or close the front door overnight. And where we live today is perfectly safe, surrounded by good Christian neighbors, out in rural North Carolina, safe, peaceful, quiet land. I don't live in a place where there is any threat of danger. I own no weapons, but my children, like I said, my eldest children, my 3 adult children are soldiers. They're in the U.S. military. So I'm not a pacifist. I'm not anti-war. I'm not anti-capital punishment. I understand what the church's teaching is on these subjects, and I'm a Catholic. I agree with the church's opinion that the death penalty is permissible, but should be avoided and used only as a last resort. That's my opinion of that question. I don't believe the death penalty should be used as a matter of convenient crime prevention or punishment. I believe that the dignity of human life and the opportunity for reformation and repentance needs to be granted with patience and mercy to people until natural death, whenever possible. Because ultimately our desire has to be for their salvation. And whatever we say about someone else's soul, God has the right to say of our soul. And we need to be careful in what we say. For example, if we arrogantly say, hey, he's had his chance. He's had his chance. Well, what am I going to say when I sin? And God looks at me and quotes my own words and says to me, well, he had his chance. I'm to be merciful because my salvation depends entirely on mercy. I believe what the church teaches concerning the death penalty. I believe what the church teaches concerning just war and the conditions of just war. And you can read these things in the Catechism. I believe that we have a right to defend ourselves and protect ourselves from harm. We have a right to life. No one has a right to kill us. We have a right to protect ourselves. But the question that has to be answered is how? How do we protect ourselves? How do we guard ourselves from harm? And how do we avoid living in fear and going too far in this regard? To think about the fact that Jesus said to us, do not fear him who can kill the body. Do not fear him who can kill the body. Jesus taught us that, and we see in his passion and crucifixion that Jesus did not fear men who threatened to kill his body. He didn't fear them. He didn't arm himself against them. He didn't resist them. He didn't try to save himself from them. He didn't fear those who can kill the body. He didn't fear them. And he reacted towards them as one who is not afraid of death or of suffering. Jesus didn't walk around like a man with a weapon strapped on his hip, drawing his weapon every time he heard a strange noise. He didn't live with that kind of timidity. That's like the spirit of Agamemnon, whom Achilles accuses of having the heart of a deer. Timid. Always afraid and ready to run. That's not the heart of a Christian man. Jesus says, do not fear him who can kill the body. And you have to ask yourself, do you fear men who can kill your body? And if you do, you shouldn't. Because it may be necessary for you to die for the sake of righteousness. And there's no use talking about Christianity if you're going to practically deny it any time that you're threatened. It may be necessary for you to die for the sake of righteousness. And you can't be afraid of dying. Jesus said, rather, you should be afraid of him who can both destroy the body and the soul in hell forever. That's who you should be afraid of. And a hasty decision to react to a threat could save a man from one who can kill his body, but may make him guilty before the one who can destroy both his body and soul in hell. And it doesn't matter what the government says. It doesn't matter what the Constitution says. Just because something is legal, just because you won't have to go to jail, doesn't mean that you haven't sinned. Abortion is legal. Homosexuality is legal. Adultery is legal. But these are mortal sins. So don't be deceived by the legality of certain actions. That doesn't mean they're not sin. And so the question that men ask me when they hear my opinion, they say, well, how am I supposed to defend my wife and children? How am I supposed to defend my wife and children if you say that I shouldn't be allowed to possess a lethal weapon? And so it appears that a man who asks this question is asking a practical question about a specific circumstance. Well, how can I defend my wife and children? But when I get into these issues with people, there's no specific circumstance that these men are actually talking about. It's just this generalized hypothetical situation, and there's no such answer, because hypothetical situations are not the subjects of deliberation. Deliberation is given to subjects that are actually in our control, that we have to make decisions in. So we'd have to identify a specific situation. So we have to deal with specific situations. What would the situation be? Where would I, and in what circumstances, would I need to, quote unquote, defend my wife and children with a lethal weapon? Now, the only situation in which I would need to defend my wife and children with a lethal weapon was a situation where I myself, or my wife or child, was threatened by a lethal weapon ourselves. So we'd have to make up a situation like, if a man broke into my house and had a gun, how would I defend myself? And this, what I consider to be a lazy idea, is that if a man breaks into my house and he has a gun, I should shoot him with my gun. And that's the solution. That's the solution. I should shoot him with my gun. I need a gun so that if a man breaks into my house with a gun, I can shoot him with my gun. And that's the idea. That men are going to break into our homes with guns, and we're going to shoot them with our guns. Now that sounds very brave, very macho when we're talking about hypothetical situations. But I'm really not sure that that's a serious answer to the question of how am I going to defend my wife and children. There are questions we should already ask and answer before we get to this dramatic duel in the living room. First of all, rather than ask how will I defend my wife and children in the presence of a man with a lethal weapon, we should ask the question, how shall I provide my wife and children with safety from such situations? And that's a very different question. That's a very different question. The Proverbs teach us that a prudent man sees evil coming and avoids it. A prudent man sees evil coming and avoids it. And so if you sit around and you foresee some danger, if you look into the future and see a man breaking into your home with a lethal weapon, and you see yourself as needing to grab your lethal weapon and shoot him before he shoots you, you're living like the foolish man rather than the prudent man. The prudent man sees evil coming and avoids it. Avoids it. He doesn't continue into a showdown with the evil. He avoids the evil. And so the question should not be, how do I defend my wife and children? The question should be, how do I positively provide my wife and children with safety? That's a different question. And that's not the question that people ask who quickly start talking about guns. Like I said, I've lived in places that were dangerous, and I live in a place today that's safe. The first consideration a man should have is whether or not he provides a home for his wife and children in a place that's safe. That's the answer. That's the first answer to the question. How shall I provide safety for my wife and children? Give them a place to live that's safe. A wise man, a prudent man, sees evil coming and avoids it. Put your family in a place that's safe. When I was teaching, I was working in Charlotte, North Carolina. My family lived out in rural North Carolina. It was a 45-minute commute to work every day for me. In the morning, I drove 45 minutes in. In the afternoon, I drove 45 minutes home. My family lived out in the country, in peace and quiet, safe. I commuted into the city. I didn't put my family in the city, where there certainly is more danger. My family lived out in the country where they were safe. Kids could go outside, play all over, run around. Nothing to fear. My wife and children were put in a place that's safe and given safety. And I commuted into the area that was considered dangerous and kept them out of it. I had no need of a gun to protect my wife and children. I make sure they're in a safe place. So that's the first thing to consider. Not how should I defend my wife and children, which is an unnecessary question to ask. It already assumes a problem that can be avoided. The right question is, how can I provide my wife and children with safety? And the first answer is, provide them with a safe place to live. And what we'll see is many men don't want to do this because it's inconvenient to them. Maybe it's expensive. They'll say, well, I can't afford... Well, I don't think that shooting people is a reasonable alternative to working to provide a safe place for your family to live. I think that's a challenge that you should accept for the sake of righteousness, for the sake of love of your neighbor and love of your enemies. Yes, it may be more expensive. Yes, it may be inconvenient. My commute into Charlotte was inconvenient, but it was good. My family was safe, which was my concern. Secondly, assuming we live in a safe place, we should consider whether or not we live in a way that attracts trouble, that provokes trouble. One reason why some men live in fear of being attacked is because they're obnoxious. They're the kind of people who get punched in the mouth. They're the kind of people who, when they were kids in school, were constantly getting beat up because they were annoying and they provoked people to anger and they asked for it. I'm 47 years old. I've never in my life had a person attack me physically. Never. Never. So for me, that's a problem that I can't relate to. But the issue here is, if the goal is to provide our wives and children with safety, then we should not do anything that unnecessarily provokes trouble. And Jesus warned us about this very thing. Jesus told us, again, assuming you care about Jesus' actual teaching, Jesus told us, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, because thieves will break in and steal. Do not store up treasure on earth where thieves break in and steal. We talk all the time about these home invasions, these theoretical home invasions. And the question is, what are these men, these imaginary threats, what are these men breaking into your home for? Are they randomly attacking you and trying to kill you for fun? Why would someone break into your home? Why would you be the object of someone's violence? Why? Is it something that you can prevent? Are they trying to break into your home because you have expensive electronics in your home? Is it because they know that you have a lot of expensive jewelry? Is it because they know you keep a lot of cash in your home or in your wallet? Is it because you have expensive cars? When I was a kid, we knew that if you invested in an expensive stereo for your car, you were going to get your windows smashed. In New Jersey, if you had a $500 car stereo put in your car as an 18-year-old kid and drove that car and parked it at the mall, you were likely going to come out and find your stereo gone. And you were warned, don't bother installing an expensive stereo or you'll end up getting your windows smashed. Don't put an expensive speaker system in your trunk because somebody will break in and steal it. Don't put expensive wheels on your car because somebody will take them. And you look at the people complaining about theft, and it's people who buy the stuff that thieves want. And you can complain. You can say, yeah, well, I have a right. Well, look, politically, legally, yes, you have a right to this and that. But that doesn't mean that morally it's prudent to do that. And if you're going to live according to the law or live according to the Constitution and not according to human morality, you're going to be miserable. Because that's not what the Constitution is for. The Constitution is not God's law. The Constitution is a contract made by the American people. And if you do things that provoke trouble, that attract criminals, you're not seeking to give your wife and children safety. You're attracting the trouble. And if the question is, well, how am I going to defend? Well, yeah, if you ask the wrong question, you're going to end up with the wrong answer. But if you ask the right question, how am I going to positively give my wife and children safety? Jesus tells you it's by living simply, by not storing up the kinds of things that attract trouble. That's how a prudent man would live. That's how a man who is sincerely concerned about the safety of his wife and children would live his life. If I didn't want my child to be attacked by a dog, I wouldn't rub barbecue sauce all over him before we walk through town. And if someone's going to say, well, I have a right to rub barbecue sauce all over my children, and then complain that the children get attacked by dogs, I don't think anyone's going to feel sorry for him. But we do the same thing in 1,000 different ways in our lives. And again, if we ask the wrong question, how am I going to defend my wife and children when the robbers break into my house after I've attracted them through the accumulation of the kinds of stuff that criminals are interested in? Well, then we're going to end up with the wrong answer. I'm going to shoot them. Right. That's the obvious solution. We're asking the wrong question, and that's why we end up with the wrong answer. We can't do things in this world that attract trouble. That's a matter of prudence. So that's a second question we should ask, whether we're doing things that are provoking trouble, that are attracting trouble, whether we're the cause of our own danger. And if we are, we need to fix that. Thirdly, and this is related to the second issue we just talked about. Thirdly, we'll often hear people say things like, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And that's true, of course. A gun laying on the ground is not going to kill anybody. But the intention of that statement is that because guns don't kill people, they should be freely accessible. But that makes no sense. That's an irrational conclusion. The premise would be true. Guns don't kill people. People kill people. That's true. But the conclusion drawn from that is not true. That because guns don't kill people, guns should be freely accessible. That is not reasonable. There's a reason why people kill people, and it's because people are evil. People are evil. We are evil. We are fallen. We are inclined to sin. We're easily provoked to anger. We struggle with self-control. We make bad decisions. We're passionate. People are evil, and people kill people. And when we make guns freely accessible, to whom do we make them accessible? We make guns freely accessible to people who kill people. So this argument makes no sense. We're not asking whether guns should be accessible to dogs and cats. We're not asking whether guns should be accessible to angels. We're talking about access to guns for people. People who kill people. That's the whole point. And so while it's true that guns don't kill people, the people who were giving access to guns do kill people. That's the problem. Guns don't kill people. People kill people. Exactly. Which is why, if you want to be contentious, we should say guns should be manufactured and placed in museums for observation, because guns don't kill people. But that's not what we're talking about. That's stupid. We're talking about giving people guns. We're talking about giving people easy access to guns. In this case of this Texas shooter, an 18-year-old is able to purchase two guns easily and go and commit a mass murder. No, you're right. The guns didn't kill the people. But the person who wanted to kill the people wanted the guns to kill the people. That should be a red flag. And again, when someone says guns don't kill people, then why do you want guns? If guns don't kill people, then why are you worried about guns in the first place? You want a gun because you know that guns do kill people. That's why you want a gun. If you're going to argue, well, when someone wants to kill someone, he's going to find a way. If you take away his guns, he'll find another way. He'll use a knife. He'll use a rock. He'll use a fork or a rope or a car. That's true. That's true. If a person really wants to kill someone else and is just completely committed to killing another person, he probably will. But when we find that that person would like to do so with a gun, we should realize that there's a reason why the person wants a gun. The person doesn't want to kill with a knife or with a stone or with a rope or with a car. The person wants to kill with a gun. And there are reasons why the person wants to kill with a gun. Because guns are very good at killing people. Guns make killing people very easy. Guns allow weak people to kill strong people. Guns allow individuals to kill groups of people. Guns allow cowardly people to kill people that they wouldn't dare attack with a knife or with a rock or a rope. Guns allow people to kill people in secret, from a distance, while hiding, and so on. Guns are very effective for killing people. That's why killers want guns. And the reason why people who are arguing for the right to own guns want guns is because they don't want to kill people with knives or stones or ropes. They want guns because guns are very efficient for killing people. So while it may be true that guns don't kill people, guns make it very easy to kill people. And not just that, but guns make it very easy to kill large numbers of people. And that's why killers want guns. And they want certain kinds of guns. They don't want a gun like Barney Fife had with one bullet. They want a gun that holds large numbers of rounds so they can shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot. They want certain kinds of guns, guns that allow them to kill large numbers of people quickly and easily. So it's true, for the sake of argument, that guns don't kill people. But people who want to kill people want guns to kill people. And people who want to defend themselves from killers want guns because guns are very good at killing people. And again, this argument blows itself up because as soon as a person argues that guns don't kill people and guns aren't necessary for killing, he's surrendering his reason for desiring a gun in the first place and should agree to not get a gun because people who want to kill can kill without guns. If that's the case, then why don't you defend your wife and children without a gun? Just use a stone or a rope or a knife or use your car. Because if you want to kill that person, you don't need a gun. Pretty stupid argument, isn't it? Of course, no one believes that, but they say it because they're not sincere when they discuss these issues. We can keep going, and all of these pro-gun arguments fall apart. We cannot give our wives and children safety with guns. We do not need guns to give our wives and children safety. That's the wrong question, and it leads to the wrong answer. We need to provide our wives and children with a safe place to live and avoid the trouble. We need to avoid attracting trouble by living contrary to Christian morals, contrary to the way of life that Christ himself taught us. If we attract trouble, we get what we ask for. And thirdly, all of these arguments for guns blow up when they're examined. We have to ask the question, what does Christian perfection teach us in answer to this question? First of all, a prudent man sees evil coming and avoids it. The way that we seek safety in this life is through prevention, by what's called circumspection, thinking before we act, thinking of the consequences of things we do, and taking responsibility for them. You're already warned. You already know that men are fallen, men are evil. You know that. That's why we have laws in the first place. Men are evil. You have to live in a way that proves that you're prudent. And when you say that you know that men are evil and then do things that attract troubles, you prove yourself to be irrational and careless, certainly not concerned with the safety of your wife and children that you talk about. If you're concerned with their safety, then provide for it and don't do anything that puts it in jeopardy. Now, 99% of any possible trouble would be avoided if we would simply seek to give our wives and children safety and do the things that are conducive to that safety. But let's just say that we've done all these things. We've taken every preventive measure. We've taken every precaution. And we find ourselves in some terrible situation where we're attacked without provocation, violently, and our life is actually in danger. Do you honestly believe that pulling out a gun and shooting the person is a means of assuring the safety of your wife and children? Certainly it's not. When people talk about shooting criminals, they often talk about it as if they're shooting at a target at a shooting range. If your life is in present and immediate danger, you're going to be shot at. You really think that trying to shoot the shooter is in the best interest of your wife and children for their safety? How many people would tell you that that's what you should do? How many people would tell you that the first thing you should do is quickly grab a gun and try to shoot the person when faced with danger? Have you ever been in a situation like that before? Have you ever actually been faced with such a situation? The idea that you're going to pull a gun out and shoot someone to protect your wife and children is not very realistic and might end up getting all three of you shot. And that's why these hypothetical situations are not the prudent way to discuss or consider these issues. Pulling out a gun, having a gun, doesn't assure anyone's safety. Jesus warned that those who live by the sword die by the sword. And again, your judgment is contradicting the teaching of Jesus. Jesus' life was in immediate danger. He was surrounded by men with clubs and swords. His disciples were in danger. And Jesus defended his disciples without any weapons. Because the reality of the situation was that they weren't actually in danger. Those men were there in the Garden of Gethsemane for a reason. And Jesus said, "Why don't you just get what you're here for?" And they took him away by himself. And there was no problem. What is a person attacking you for? Your possessions? Let them take them. Money? Let them have it. If a person pulls out a gun in a convenience store and asks for money, or robs a bank and asks for money, what do the tellers do? Do the tellers try to shoot the guy? No, they hand over all the money. It's just money. People who work in stores are taught to just let robbers go, not because they think robbing is okay, but because nothing that they're going to take is worth risking your life for. What exactly are you ready to shoot for? Your stuff? Is it really for the safety of your family? You think starting a shootout is the way to protect your wife and children from danger? These questions and discussions are just not realistic. And in different areas where we can look and see what people actually do who face these situations, they don't pull out guns and start shooting. And so this whole question is largely stirred up by political controversy. It's not a realistic issue. It's the wrong question to ask in the first place. The answer of possessing a gun has nothing to do with keeping anyone's wife or children safe. Starting a shootout is certainly not going to guarantee anyone's safety. And people who face present dangers like these don't draw guns. And so this whole argument is really a childish, imaginary fantasy that's driven by groundless fear and an unrealistic idea of what the result of such a decision would be in such a situation. We need to look realistically at Jesus as an example of perfection. And we see a man who had no weapons, who was not combative, who didn't live in fear of his enemies, who didn't live in fear of pain or death. A man who lived with prudence, who avoided avoidable trouble, who didn't provoke people to anger. When people cursed at him, he didn't respond back with cursing, but with a blessing. When people mistreated him, he didn't return evil for evil or try to fight them. He prayed for them. And in the end, when men resolved to kill him, he handed himself over and resigned himself to the providence of God, knowing that in God he was safe, not just for that moment, because he didn't fear those who can kill the body, but forever. And we can see, if we think about this from a spiritually minded, eternal perspective, from a Christian perspective that actually believes in the resurrection of the dead and the judgment and eternal life, we're asking the wrong questions. These are the wrong questions, and the wrong questions lead us to the wrong answers. This is why it's my opinion that the government, which exists for the sake of promoting and protecting the common good, the best interest of the people, should strictly regulate access to lethal weapons. And again, I think one of the best questions to ask is, if they're not dangerous, why do you want one? If guns don't kill people, why do you want one in the first place? And if you want one because they do effectively kill people, that should be a clear reason to you why, considering that people are evil, and people have killed people from the beginning, why they should be strictly regulated for the sake of the common good. That's my opinion, and those are some of my reasons. I could go into more, but those are some of the most basic reasons why I hold the opinion I do. And if you'd like to talk about this, not in a political way, I'm not interested in the copied and pasted political sound bites and the campaign talk. If you're interested in talking about this from a Christian perspective, I'd love to hear an opposing view. But like I said, I'm not interested in right versus left political nonsense, because this is not ultimately a political question. This is a question of Christian morality that we should, after answering the question, seek to promote through our political action. God bless.